Hey everyone, so this is everything I read between July and September. It was an interesting month. There was some good stuff, some average stuff. So I'm going to review all these and then at the end I'm going to rank them all, see which came out on top. First up, I read Artemis by Andy Weir, which is the middle book in terms of what he's published. He wrote The Martian, then he wrote this, then he did Hail Mary. This one I enjoyed. A lot of people think it's a bit of a dip. It is a bit of a dip, I guess, but I still thoroughly enjoyed it. I've done a full review, so you can click on the link if you want to see that review. Okay, second book I read was Elantris by Brandon Sanderson. I was really looking forward to this. I've read Mistborn. This was his next one that I was going to read, and I have now read it. I have a full review of this. In short, it's great. Loved it. 4 stars. Not quite 5 stars. Few flaws, but definitely a good book. Next up is Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes. Now, this is often on top 10 lists of the best sci-fi novels of all time, and I can understand that. It is very good. I wouldn't say it's a 5-star for me, but it's definitely a 4-star. It's based off a short story that Keyes wrote. That short story actually won the Hugo in 1959, and then he went on to write this, expand the story out, and this won the 1966 Hugo for Best Novel. Briefly, it's about a man called Charlie and coincidentally a mouse called Algernon. The mouse has had a successful operation that has made it smart, and now Charlie is undergoing the same procedure. And where this book shines is its use of the book medium. The book is a series of progress reports written by Charlie. Charlie has a low IQ at the start of the book, and the first progress reports are full of atrocious spelling and bad grammar, and it's apparent that he is unaware of what's actually going on. And then as the book progresses, he gets smarter and the writing style changes. It's totally brilliant as a concept. Now, while this is a great book, I don't feel like I can give it a 5-star rating because it's kind of depressing. A lot of horrible stuff happens, not gross stuff, but like people are mean to the main character, and there's a lot of people being horrible to each other. And normally I'd give a 4-star rating to a book because it's something I'd like to read again. This is one of those rare situations where I am giving this book 4 stars, but I have no desire to read this book again. It's not a fun book, but it's totally worth the 4 stars for the idea and the execution. Bridger over at the Library Ladder, great YouTuber, he said he prefers the short story. And so I have this book, The Hugo Winners, that has a bunch of short stories that won the Hugo Awards. And so I read the short story and I have to agree with him. The short story, I think, does what this book does, but better. And the short story is straight to the point. The novel does add some interesting stuff, but it also adds some subplots that kind of aren't necessary. So I would highly recommend actually reading the short story in preference to the novel. And it's only about 30 pages, so try and find it. You can find it online. It's a fantastic read. Okay, next up I read Strata by Terry Pratchett. This is the second novel Terry wrote. It's not part of the Discworld. The first book he wrote, Dark Side of the Sun, was not great. This one's okay. It's okay. Unlike his first book, it's apparent from the outset that this one is supposed to be humorous. It wasn't quite clear with the first book whether it was supposed to be funny or not. Some of it was, but some of it just wasn't. And this one is not as consistently witty as Discworld, but you can definitely see Pratchett's emerging style. And funnily enough, a couple of times as I was reading this, I felt like I was reading Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which is an obvious influence on this. This is coming out very soon after Hitchhiker's Guide came out. And of course, this is sci-fi humor, not the fantasy humor of Discworld. Terry was still getting to grips with writing. Sometimes it's a bit confusing as to who's talking. You have to be totally awake to be able to read this, and even then, it's sometimes a struggle. But the further along it went, it felt more and more familiar to Discworld and the style of Terry's writing. Now, just briefly, what's it about? The main character works for a company that builds worlds. So again, a little bit of that Hitchhiker's influence because of that, world building thing, Earth being a built world. Apparently this book is a parody of Larry Niven's Ringworld, which I haven't read, but for those of you who have, that's apparently what it's a parody of. Anyway, via a series of circumstances, the main character finds herself with two other aliens, and they're on a flat Earth. It's a disk world. It's not the disk world, but it's like our Earth, but flat. And the ultimate point of the story is to find out who built it and why, which apparently is one of the things that Ringworld is about. And again, tying into that Discworld thing, there's actually a bar up in space called the Broken Drum. There's a few things like that tie it ever so slightly to the Discworld. Ultimately, it's a bit ho-hum and the ending is a bit flat. This one's really only for the curious, the people that want to see the development of Terry Pratchett's writing and the first inklings of the Discworld. Oh, and there was one F-bomb in this, which was very jarring to read in a Pratchett novel. Next up, The Losers by David Eddings. Yes, David Eddings of the Beleriand fame. This is one of his standalones. This is a very odd book. It's about a guy who goes off to college. He rooms with a delinquent rich guy. Then he gets involved in a car crash and loses a leg. Then he moves to a different city and lives in a very depressing neighborhood and spends all his time just observing all the losers in the neighborhood. Yeah, that's about it. And how evil social workers are. But it's still written by Eddings, and that means it's extremely easy to read. His writing style is very expressive, and he always gives very good context, so you always understand what's going on. He also has a lot of dialogue, which is always easy to read, and the cast of characters are all quite distinctive. There are occasional hints of his characters from other books, like the Beleriand, but they're very slight. And for once, his female characters don't just sound like another version of Polgara or Sinedra. Some interesting facts about this. The college in the book is Reed College in Washington State, which is where Steve Jobs went, and it's also where all of Eddings' manuscripts now reside. And then most of the book is actually set in Spokane, Washington, which is where David Eddings grew up. And the other thing, this was largely written in the 1970s, before he wrote the Beleriand, and he wrote it basically after he had just finished serving jail time for all that horrible stuff. And that's probably why he had to deal with social workers at that time and why he despises them and, I guess, write what you know. Ultimately, it's kind of about the triumph of someone taking control of their life and helping others do the same without the help of social workers, and while the other losers crash and burn. I don't think I've ever felt more meh about a book. I got to the end and felt, of all the books I've ever read, this is one of them. It wasn't terrible, it just wasn't the height of excitement. Okay, this is heavy. Advent 9 by T. Alan Horne. This was sent to me by Alan. This is the first time an author reached out to me and sent me one of their books. So I thought, okay, I'll give it a go. It's about a teenager who is the last superhero on Earth and his battle against his evil twin from another dimension. The first thing to note about this book is it's edited by David Farland, also known as Dave Wolverton. Dave Wolverton taught at Brigham Young University and taught, amongst others, Brandon Sanderson and Stephanie Meyer. So he's a pretty well-known guy. He also wrote a bunch of Star Wars books. Now, my thoughts as I read this. Unfortunately, not a good start. Some of the descriptions just make no sense. A lot of the writing is serviceable, but once every few pages, there's just something odd. Like a person says something that doesn't sound like something people would say or that particular character would say, or there's a description that just didn't make much sense to me. Really, a lot of the dialogue between the characters is the kind that you get in comics, where it's just all this kind of nonsense posturing. Also, it's unclear who the audience is. In some respects, the writing is kind of like the stuff you get in a Zack Power aimed at 8-year-olds. But then there's things like swearing and killing people and other sorts of dark stuff. There are some okay ideas in here, and the plot isn't too bad. I just think the execution is a bit flawed. There was one little bit where I found I was enjoying myself, where some characters go to this night zoo, and I was like, oh, this is interesting. And the writing did get better as it went along. Otherwise, the book is just too long and ultimately boring for me. Funnily enough, at a number of places I thought to myself, this would actually make a decent comic. And this is supposed to be a comic in novel format. Maybe it would have been better as a comic. I tried, I really did. I read the whole thing, but I can only give this 2 stars. It's okay, Alan. Will White is a hugely successful author, and I gave his first book 2 stars as well. And I also gave Terry Pratchett's first book 2 stars, so you're in good company. All right, next up, The Road by Cormac McCarthy. May he rest in peace. For those that don't know, this is basically a story about a father and son as they travel across a very desolate post-apocalyptic USA. That's about it. Wait till the end to see my rating. So these are some of the thoughts I had while reading this. I'm not enjoying this much. It's just a bit wanky, fancy pants literary prose. I'm also having to look up words every few pages, which is fine, but it does interrupt the flow a bit. I wish I had such a good vocabulary. I like knowing the words for things, but is it really necessary to specify that a piece of furniture is a break front when a character is exploring their dilapidated family home, and you want to be focusing on why the child is scared? For some reason, the way it's written feels like he's telling rather than showing. It's just not engaging. And they seem to sleep outside needlessly. They come across houses and barns, and they don't sleep in them. It just doesn't make sense to me. But the book actually grew on me. Around halfway through, there's actually a bit of joy. I won't go into it because of spoilers, but it was like, oh, that's actually nice. And the fancy words seem to stop as well, although not entirely. It's like Cormac McCarthy actually got to the meat of the story. And an interesting thing about this book is there's no quotes around any of the dialogue, and the apostrophes are often lacking. And about halfway through the book, I kind of realized, oh, that actually makes total sense. It's like everything from civilization is kind of disappearing. So that makes total sense. It was a good idea. And then we're back to the flowery words. And that's kind of at odds with what I've just said, that civilization is kind of being stripped away. Meanwhile, he's got all these fancy words. And it gets more and more flowery towards the end. I even had to look up a word in the last paragraph, which almost made me throw the book across the room. I mean, seriously, it's the end of the book and I'm having to look up a word. And it's not like they're just rare words. Some of them are just like totally, like really archaic, weird words that you have to look up online because they're not in a dictionary. Ultimately, I'm not sure how I feel about the book. The ending is kind of bittersweet. I have no desire to read it again, but I think it's a 4-star book for me. I love experiments with form, which this does well, and I love the feeling of desolation that he's able to evoke. So, no, I don't want to read it again, but it gets 4 stars from me. Okay, Lays of Beleriand by Tolkien. Yes, by Tolkien. Edited by Christopher Tolkien, his son. This is the 3rd volume of the History of Middle-earth, which is a compilation of Tolkien's unpublished writings with editorial comments by his son Christopher. The first 2 books in this History of Middle-earth were detailing the very earliest stuff that Tolkien wrote when he was still developing his concepts, and most of what came to be known as Middle-earth was actually a secret history of kind of England, or an alternate history of England. This one is mostly 2 big poems, or lays, and it's basically 2 of the major stories that appear in prose form in the Silmarillion. The first is the Children of Hurin, and the second is the story of Beren and Luthien. So, I'm not a fan of poetry, and this was hard going, especially the first poem. I often couldn't understand what I was reading, to tell you the truth. What saves it for me is I have read these stories before, different versions appearing in 3 places. If you're reading things in order, it appeared in the Silmarillion, then there was a version in Unfinished Tales, and then there was another version in the Book of Lost Tales, the part 1 and part 2 of the history of Middle-earth. So at least I didn't have to spend time looking up who people were or figuring out where places were on the map, because I already knew all that kind of stuff from my previous readings. It was still pretty slow going though. This stuff really gets down into the weeds. There were so many ideas and characters and lineages that Tolkien was inventing, and they went through so many iterations that sometimes it's a bit hard to follow, because at the start of a poem, someone will have a particular name, and then it will change midway through, and then it will change again. Christopher at least kind of modifies the poems so that they are consistent throughout. But when you're reading the notes, it's like, who is that? Who is that? Who is that? Who is that? That guy. Oh, that guy. Yes, that guy. The first poem is written in an alliterative style. The second major poem is written in a rhyming style, and it's much more readable. What I find most interesting is the chronology of Tolkien's writing. The second poem is annotated with dates by Tolkien himself, and so you can see bursts of activity like when he's away on a holiday, and then there'll be like a year or two where there's only 30 lines written. This was all written before The Hobbit in the 1920s. There's one extra bit where Tolkien started rewriting the second poem after having finished The Lord of the Rings in 1955, and that is actually really nice to read. It's very readable, and it's kind of a loss that he never actually went ahead and finished that. This one's a little hard for me to rate. I gave the other ones 4 stars, but I can only give this one 3. I even considered giving it a 2, but I think that's a bit harsh. It's definitely only recommended for the completionists. I'm looking forward to getting on to the more interesting volumes later that detail the writing of The Lord of the Rings. The last book I read is Scorpion Swamp. This is a fighting fantasy novel, which means it's like a choose-your-own-adventure, but you roll dice. However, when I read these, I actually follow through every possibility. So I have my fingers in a lot of places, and I kind of backtrack and I read every single option. This one is by Steve Jackson, not the Steve Jackson on the header. It's actually a different Steve Jackson, who was the USA Steve Jackson, who was also a game designer. This one had a promising start and a nice initial story, and you also get to choose between 3 different quests, so that was interesting. And it also tried some new things, which is obviously to be commended, but is also its downfall. The main innovation for this one is you're able to travel back and forward between places. All the other fighting fantasy I've ever read, you always have to move forward. You can't ever go back down a corridor that you've just come from. In Scorpion Swamp, the swamp is basically set out on this kind of a grid, and you can just travel anywhere willy-nilly. But this has 2 consequences. First of all, it means that at every location, there's a paragraph saying, hey, have you been here before? If so, turn to this. And then in that next paragraph, you'll get something like, hey, did you kill this monster or did you leave it alone? It's kind of a poor man's way of storing the state of the game. The second consequence is it means there's not a lot of variety. Basically, every location is some variation of, hey, you're in a clearing. Here are some things you can do. And you do X or Y. And then, okay, here are the exits. There really aren't any extended sequences or scenes like in other fighting fantasy books. And the ending of each of the quests kind of fell a bit flat. So this is only worth 3 stars in my opinion. So, ranking all these books. Unfortunately, Advent 9, that's a 2-star. That's on the bottom. Next up, Strata. I think I gave this 3 stars. It's whatever. The Losers, another 3-star, slightly better than Strata, I think. Readable, it was fine. Scorpion Swamp, another 3-star, it was okay. Lays of Beleriand by Tolkien, again, another 3-star, a lot of 3 stars this 3 months. The Road, 4 stars, but definitely borderline, so only just 4 stars. Then Artemis, a definite 4-star from me. Flowers for Algernon, borderline, but I'm going with the short story, definite 4 stars. Not quite 5-star, but definite 4-star. So that means coming out on top is Elantris by Brandon Sanderson. That's my stack of books. Hope you enjoyed that, and I'll see you in the next video.